thank you so much again for having us presenting at this conference. I'm really excited to be talking to you guys, at least virtually. And thank you so much again for being so accommodative. So today I'm gonna guide you through our new project, which is titled Glossy Green Banks, and it's a joint work with Mariassunta, Giannetti, Loumioti, and Caterina Mendicino. As that Caterina is at the ECB, the usual disclaimer applies. All right, so recently we have seen a number of banks portraying themselves as pioneers in green lending and increasingly paying more attention to environmentally themed activities. At the same time, we see that banks are jumping on this wagon of voluntary disclosures into a large number of activities they are doing. And specifically, we see them increasingly emphasize environmental activities in their investors' reports, as well as the voluntary disclosures. Now, we know that this is associated with a large number of benefits, such as better ESG rating, more loyal customer base, or lower cost of capital. However, at the same time, we have also seen a rising skepticism by market participants or regulators. And this begs to ask whether banks and their environmentally themed disclosures are actually credible, or whether they contain more unsubstantiated claims that only symbolically comply with the new institutional demands. And so in this paper, we want to answer this question, and specifically, we're going to ask, what is the relationship between banks' environmental disclosures and their actual bank lending activities? And in the paper, we're going to proceed in two steps. The first step is that we're going to use annual and sustainability reports to analyze the environmental disclosures of European banks. And the second, we're going to really shift our attention to the relationship between these disclosures and bank lending to firms. And we're going to examine what is this relationship when thinking about lending to brown versus green industries, when thinking about borrowers with different level of greenhouse gas emissions, and finally, when thinking about borrowers that describe their businesses as green based on the EU taxonomy. So I'm going to walk you through a bunch of results today, but before doing so, let me give you the preview of all key findings in the paper. So we start first by unpacking the environmental disclosures of European banks, and we show that they are positively correlated with the environmental risk of the country where the bank is located, as well as the social activism of that country, its regulation, and as well as a positive correlation between the bank disclosure and the bank ESG rating. We further show that banks with higher environmental disclosures tend to be more involved in the issuance of green bonds. Now, the focus of our paper is to look into lending to firms. And we find the following things. First of all, banks that stress environment more in their disclosures actually end up lending more to high emission borrowers. We don't find any evidence in support that this funding would be helping to transition loans towards more greener technologies. Instead, we show that banks tend to lend to weakest borrowers in these brown industries, and this is especially so when the banks have low capital adequacy ratios. So overall, in the paper, we document that banks tend to overemphasize their climate goals while continuing their relationship with these polluting borrowers. In other words, there is a disconnect between what banks say in their disclosures and what they actually do in their loan book. All right, so let me give you a few words about the data and the methodology of this paper. So on the data side, we make use of the loan level credit registry, AnaCredit, which is essentially a harmonized loan level data of all Eurozone commercial loans outstanding. So this is the data set maintained by the European Central Bank. And we focus specifically on the margins such as loan size, interest rate, and maturity. And importantly, the reporting threshold of AnaCredit is giving us loans higher than 25,000 euro, which is a large chunk of the cross-section of lending to firms in the Eurozone. And specifically, we're going to focus on the sample of newly issued loans in the period of 2014 to 2020. Now, before I go any further, I'd like to emphasize that the use of AnaCredit is really unique because it essentially allows us to observe the entire loan book of a bank. So unlike syndicated lending, which can be well observable by market participants, these loan level credit registry data we make use of is actually unobservable to most of the market participants. So they actually cannot infer whether the bank is or is not lending towards greener businesses just based on the public disclosures. All right. So as I mentioned, the key focus of our paper is going to be looking into whether these banks are or are not making brown or green loans. So it probably, is the right time to say a little bit more how we measure them. We're going to measure them in 2 steps. The first step that's going to allow us to use the entire cross-section of an credit is to define the loans being brown or green based on its industry level. In other words, we use the data from Eurostat, and that allows us to observe greenhouse gas emissions by country, NACE to industry, and year. And we're going to standardize it by the industry value added. And essentially, we're going to call the loan as brown if its greenhouse gas emission in that country, in that NACE to in that year, falls into the top quintile of the distribution of all greenhouse gas emissions. And we're going to call it green if it falls into the bottom quintile. In addition to this, for the larger borrowers, we also observe directly their firm level emissions. And this is the data source of Urgentem, which is allowing us to observe firm level scope 1 and scope 2 emission intensities directly firm by firm. And finally, we're going to complement it with a number of more standard variables on banks and firms coming from Orbis, SBTI, FinRep, etc. All right, so the first contribution of the paper is our ability to measure the environmental disclosures. Now, if we were to perform this task in the US, it would be much more trivial because we would essentially go to Edgar and download all the documents on one spot. This is not exactly feasible in case of the European banks, so we visit all the websites of all our key banks and we download and process all documents that allow us to construct this proxy. This is going to give us roughly 1,400 documents, half of which approximately are annual reports, and the second half contains a large heterogeneity of reports, such as sustainability reports, integrated reporting, etc., etc. Now, we're going to start reading these reports, and around 50 bank reports, we're going to start building the dictionary, which we further, include additional words coming from additional data sources, such as the rep risk for the relevant environmental topics, as well as the materiality map from the SASB. So in sum, we're going to build a dictionary that includes either words or bigrams that are related to topics such as energy use, emission, diversity, or activities that are commonly known to be considered to affect pollution. And you can see some example on my slide. So overall, our key measure is going to be what we call environmental disclosures, which is a ratio of the environmental keywords to the total number of words in the reports, excluding the stop words, so things like articles and so on. All right, so this is going to be our key measure. Or jumping to the credit analysis, let me give you a sense of what does this keyword really correlate with. So this is a larger table, but I'm going to guide you through it in steps. So what you see highlighted right now, we see that banks with higher share of environmental disclosures tend to be located in countries with higher level of social activism, as well as a higher environmental risk. I'm going to come back to the bank characteristics towards the end of my talk, but let me draw your attention to the rectangle that you see highlighted now, which shows that banks with higher environmental disclosures tend to benefit higher environmental scores. And it doesn't really matter whether you would use the MSCI, Sustainalytics, Bloomberg, etc. And finally, we see that banks with higher environmental disclosures are also more active in the issuance of green bonds. Now, the key contribution of our paper is to focus on lending. And so before I show you the actual granular evidence, let me show you one graph. On the x-axis, you see the share of the loan portfolio that is extended to firms in brown industries. And on the y-axis, you see the measure of the environmental disclosures I just described. And interestingly, as you can see, there's a positive relationship between the two variables. In other words, banks with more extensive environmental disclosures actually have a larger share of proportion of loans going towards brown industries. So in the first part of the paper, we explore this result more formally. And what I mean by that is that we run the following regression when on the left-hand side, we use a number of loan characteristics. Let me start with the amount. So the left-hand side variable here is the log amount of newly issued credit that a firm F receives from bank B in year T. And this firm is located in industry I in country C. So the most important coefficient for us is the one highlighted in orange. And that's an interaction coefficient of a brown and high environmental reporter. Brown, as I mentioned, is a dummy variable that takes a value of 1 if the industry where this firm is located, in terms of its greenhouse gas emissions to the gross value added, ranks in the top quintile of the entire distribution and 0 other ones. And the high environmental reporter is a dummy variable using our environmental disclosures. And we're going to name the bank as a high environmental reporter if it ranks in the top quintile of this environmental reporter measure in that particular year. Now, most importantly for us, we need to think carefully about controlling for the demand for credit. And we're going to do it in 2 steps. The first step is we're going to introduce industry, country, and time fixed effect. And in the second step, we're going to move 1 step further, and we're going to introduce the interaction of firm and time fixed effect. So you may be familiar with the Kvajamian type of estimate. So we're going to compare how one firm, one polluting firm that receives credit from 2 different banks. One of these banks is a high environmental reporter. The other bank doesn't seem to talk all that much about the environment. And we're going to compare the issuance of new credit towards this firm. Furthermore, we're going to control for additional bank characteristics, either by a combination of bank fixed effect and additional controls, or by introducing the time varying bank fixed effect.
Martina, you have 8 minutes.
All right. Perfect. So in other words, if we believe that banks with more environmental disclosure should engage more in greener lending practices, we should expect this coefficient beta 1 to be negative. Now, let's look into what we see. So it's not negative, as you can see, and if anything, it's even statistically significantly positive. And furthermore, moving to the columns 4 and 5, which have the firm time fixed effect, you see that the coefficient remains positive and statistically significant, which suggests that high environmental reporters extend more credit to firms in brown industries compared to other banks. Now, you can think that maybe banks are lending more to these very brown industries, but they're compensating for it to lending a lot also to the very green industries. So we're going to repeat our analysis, but now I'm going to use the dummy green that takes the value of 1 if the lending comes to firms in the greenest industry, so in the lowest quintile of the greenhouse gas emission. And as you can see, there's not much there. There doesn't seem to be the effect that banks would be compensating their brown loans with extensively lending more towards green industries. Now, the first 2 results I showed you were using the industry level greenhouse gas emission. So what we can do next is that for the subset of our firms, we actually observe firm level greenhouse gas emissions that are going to allow us to go after this question a little bit tighter. And in columns 2 and 3, you see the results of this exercise using the combination of country, industry, and year fixed effect. And you can see here that once again, banks with more extensive environmental disclosures extend more credit to the borrowers with higher emissions. Now, we can move farther and saturate this all the way with the firm time fixed effect. So you see a couple of things. So our sample drops substantially and the statistical significance disappears. But the lack of statistical significance, if anything, is still saying to us that a high reporting bank is lending approximately the same amount to a high emission borrower as a bank that doesn't seem to pay all that much attention to the environment. In other words, we show that the higher environmental disclosures are far from being associated with greener or at least less brown lending practices. Now, shifting attention to additional margins. So until now, I showed you new lending to all firms. So these were new credit issued by a bank to any type of a firm. So now we can focus only to the creation of brand new bank-firm relationships. And one thing you can notice here is that there appears to be at least a little bit of a silver lining. And in 2 out of 5 specifications, we see that higher environmental reporters at least try to reduce their new lending exposure to the brown industries. Fast forward to the termination of loans, we once again find that high environmental reporters are less likely to terminate relationship with their brown industries. In the paper, we also aggregate this up on the bank level. And once again, we find that banks that are more environmentally disclosing are once again increasing the share of their portfolio towards brown, which is in line with the first graph I showed you in the motivation. So overall, there doesn't seem to be a connection between what banks say in their environmental statements and what they actually do in their loan book. So the big question is, why is that? So the first potential idea would be that there's nothing wrong with lending to brown firms, because what banks can be essentially doing is that they can be helping the transition of these brown industries towards lower emission, greener technologies. Now, one problem with measuring this very carefully is that we observe the greenhouse gas emission for only 6 years, and this could potentially be too short of a period to actually see a meaningful impact on lowering their greenhouse gas emission. So in the paper, we developed 4 additional approaches that could help us proxy for this channel. So the first approach is driven by the fact that switching to the green technology requires either high investment or R&D. So we can compare the lending of high environmental reporters to 2 brown borrowers in the same industry, in the same country, in the same time, but one of these borrowers would be having high investment or high R&D, and we can compare the outcomes. The second idea is a link to the fact that it tends to be new entrants that are more prone to innovate or disrupt old technologies. So once again, we can compare the lending of high environmental reporters towards 2 observationally similar borrowers, but one of them tends to be younger than the others. The third idea that we could test is that firms can also set their science-based targets that essentially mean that they define clearly their commitment path to reduce emissions. So once again, we can compare observationally equivalent firms. One of them is the SBTi signatory. The other is just a regular firm in the brown industry. And then finally, we present a novel textual analysis using capital IQ data, and we compare 2 firms in the same industry using the business description. So you can think of 2 textile industries, 2 firms in the textile industry. One of them is doing more of a, upcycling, green-friendly technologies, and the other one is more of a fast fashion. All right, so here is the overview of the results using the first 3 proxies. The 4th proxy you can find in the paper, but overall, regardless which proxy we use, we don't find any evidence that these high environmental reporters would be actually funding the transition of these businesses towards greener. If anything, you see the coefficient goes the wrong way, or it's even statistically significant and it goes the wrong direction. In the paper, we further document that banks are not altering any other contractual terms that could be potentially working in contrast with the credit amount. So on the slide that you see right now, you see that these high environmental reporters are actually not charging higher interest rates on these loans. And they're also not issuing these loans with shorter maturity, which could potentially lead these firms into a rollover risk. In one of these specifications, you actually see that the coefficient is going the opposite direction. So finally, in the paper, we explore the role of this bank lending.
2 minutes.
Perfect. We explore this lending of towards firms with a strong relationship. And in the columns 1 and 2, I'm measuring it with the exposure. So the exposure is the variable that measures the share of credit that a firm F gets from this specific bank as a share of firm's total credit. And you can see that high environmental reporters tend to lend more to brown borrowers, especially so if they already extended a larger share of their loans in the past, which seems to suggest that banks are reluctant to discontinue the established credit relationship. Now, in addition to the importance of the relationship banking, our results also point out the opacity of the lending, specifically to the zombie lending behavior. There's an ample literature, especially in the European setting, that has shown that unprofitable banks or undercapitalized banks are more likely to lend to unhealthy firms. And we measure these zombie firms with 3 different proxies, whether they have low ROA, low sales per employee ratio, or low interest coverage ratio. And you can see in the results here that in 4 out of 6 columns, the result is positive and statistically significant, which suggests that this discrepancy between the actual lending and the reporting is accentuated by the bank's propensity to continue to lend to these financially unhealthy brown borrowers. Now, linking this back to the zombie lending, we know from the existing literature that banks might be reluctant to stop lending to zombies because this would force them to realize losses. In the context of the green lending, this brings additional moment. And that is, recall that these loan level data are confidential. They are unobservable to the market participants. So if banks were to realize these losses, they would not only need to realize the losses, but they would also need to discuss and publicly explain their exposures to the brown industries, which are with disconnect with what we see in their environmental disclosures. In other words, this relationship between zombie firms and banks tends to hinder the ability of the banks to reduce the environmental impact. Now, finally, in the paper, we exploit a number of bank characteristics, and I'm going to leave you with this just to say that we see that this result is particularly driven by banks that have lower capital adequacy ratio and by banks that are overall larger, and as a result can be under larger pressure to actually integrate such climate goals. So I'm going to wrap up by saying that in this paper, we show that banks that stress environment more in their disclosures actually end up lending more to high emission borrowers. We don't find any evidence that this would be favoring transition towards green technologies. And we show that such close relationship between banks and unproductive zombie firms tends to limit the reliability of the bank environmental disclosures and potentially hinder the transition of the economy towards greener economy. All right, thank you.
Just let me share my slides. All right, I'm good to go. So thank you so much to the organizers for asking me to discuss this paper. I really enjoyed having the chance to read it closely. Just a couple points before we start. So first, of course, the normal Fed disclaimer applies, and just one other thing I think I should point out is last academic year, Martina visited the New York Fed, so we were colleagues for a bit. So Martina did a great job presenting the paper, but I'm just going to give my own take first. So I think there's this sense that in Europe, especially regulators and institutional investors are really asking banks to work on this transition to a greener economy and facilitate it in their lending activities. And of course, European banks will use disclosures to sort of show off that they're doing this and to show how environmentally friendly they are. But there's obviously a question of are they telling the truth or are they lying? So this paper is going to ask that exact question. Do environmental disclosures accurately reflect European banks' lending portfolios? And this paper has, I think, probably my single favorite trait in an empirical paper, which is that you can really give the main message of the paper in one simple figure. So here, the authors show a very simple bin scatter plot, where on the x-axis is the percentage of a loan portfolio that's brown, and on the y-axis is the environmental disclosure. And it seems like the banks are not necessarily telling the truth in their disclosures, that they are lending more brown to, they lend more to brown when they disclose being more environmentally friendly. And the authors in the paper make a case that this is a greenwashing sort of thing, where the lenders are doing this on purpose. Much of this lending is to borrowers with a pre-existing relationship. There's a question, of course, that there's a sense, I think, that lenders will be making loans to brown borrowers to help them become greener, but the authors don't find any evidence that this is the case. And in fact, show that this seems to be zombie lending, that they're lending to their borrowers that are the least profitable in these cases. And I think something that's important to mention is, my sense is these results are extremely robust to all different sorts of things, like adjusting the sample, using different definitions of brown industries, different fixed effects. No matter what, you seem to see generally similar results. So there's a lot that I like about this paper. I could give a whole presentation on that, but just to put it in one slide, because I'm the discussant, I think this is obviously a very important question. There's a lot of work in the disclosure space on how useful disclosure is for understanding ESG properties. I think that this paper is a really nice setting, because when you could look at banks, you sort of have project level investment information, and you can ask all of these interesting questions about relationships and those sorts of things. So I think this is very clever. And I think something to point out is, I mean, this is not a descriptive paper, but I think that just descriptively showing that lending doesn't match the disclosures from that first figure is in and of itself a big contribution. I really like the relationship lending and zombie lending findings. I find that they really deepen the paper. and I find it very convincing. I encourage the authors to lean into this as much as possible. I think it goes without saying the data collection and textual analysis, like downloading all of those reports that are not always consistent, building this dictionary. Both of those things are very impressive. The biggest complaint I have about the paper is that all of the low-hanging fruit the authors have taken care of. It's very polished. There's a lot of nice robustness checks. So because of that, it's not the easiest paper to discuss. So it's a great paper. So I'm gonna have 2 comments in this paper. And one thing I should point out is it seems from the presentation that the authors have already made progress on both of these comments, even since the version of the paper I read. So the first is I'm going to think about this greenwashing effect that seems to be one of the main things that the authors have in mind. And then I'm going to be very nitpicky about whether this is about the environment or climate. And like I said, the authors have dealt with most of the low-hanging fruit. So I view these as kind of like fine-tuning that could help the paper. So it wasn't really discussed in the presentation a ton. There was some mention, but in this version, in the paper that I read at least, the authors talk about greenwashing as an important channel explaining the disconnect shown in this paper. Something I would like to point out is I've actually seen this. I saw this paper presented a couple months ago, and this was toned down since then. So previously they were leaning more on greenwashing, and now they're less so. I think it's of course very appealing to try to understand whether banks are exhibiting greenwashing in their lending behavior, but there's some evidence in the paper that this isn't necessarily what's going on. It's not the strongest, but there's some evidence consistent with banks with environmental disclosures trying to do better, even though they're not doing the best job. So this evidence, I would say, is, as Martina mentioned, banks with stronger disclosures are involved in more green bond issuance. This isn't lending markets per se in the same way that you're thinking about this paper, but green bonds are important. And I think they do have an economically meaningful effect. The literature seems to show that. There's the evidence that banks with stronger disclosures are less likely to form new relationships with brown borrowers. So this indicates that they're trying to do better. And banks also seem to be less likely to terminate relationships with green borrowers. So another story I think that you could tell that would be consistent with all the evidence in the paper is that banks want to become greener, but because of these pre-existing relationships, it's harder to become greener. It takes time to unwind these relationships, and it could take a very long time. And in this case, the environmental disclosures could be used as a signal that banks are trying to become greener, even if it takes a while. The authors push the greenwashing channel a little bit by showing this effect that banks are failing to expand into green industries, which I would say is an across-industry test. And they also show that after banks lend to these brown borrowers, the borrowers don't seem to be trying to become greener. So within industry, there doesn't seem to be the change. But I have this nagging question, and I think that Martina has this in mind too, because she brought it up, is what if the time period was longer? It could be that if we had more, a higher time series of the data, then maybe we'd start to see that there is this shift. So I have 2 recommendations that the authors could push. One is, this probably seems unlikely to find some random variation in environmental disclosures, maybe using the creation of laws for mandatory sustainability reporting as a shock. I don't expect that this would necessarily have much power because the authors do show that there's not actually a difference if you look in countries with mandatory sustainability reporting. The second recommendation is the one that it seems like the authors are pursuing, and I think makes the most sense, is just to soften the discussion on greenwashing. I think the concern here could be that Sure. Thank you. If you push away from that channel, maybe there's less contribution, but I think if you push the relationship lending and zombie lending, this won't be so much of an issue. So my second comment is very, very nitpicky. This is something that I don't care a ton about personally, but working in this literature, I know people complain about with my papers. So I have this quote from the paper explaining the disclosure. Our environmental disclosure measure is based on climate-related keywords. And there's points in the paper where the discussion tends to go back between terms related to the environment and terms related to climate. And there were times reading the paper that I kind of forgot that this was environment and was thinking it was climate. But if you look at the dictionary, there are some terms that are closer to other things that have to do with the environment, especially the biodiversity front. And I think we should be very precise with what we're thinking about in the paper, especially because now we have this new literature on biodiversity. And my suggestion here is to motivate more on the environment more broadly and less on climate. And again, it seems like since the version of the paper I read, based on the presentation, the authors are moving in this direction. So I commend them for that. I have some other minor points I could talk to Martina about offline. I think the biggest one to mention, and this is more of an issue with the whole literature rather than this paper, is I think it's always easier to think about brown industries rather than green. So for example, like green industries are classified as low emissions. Advertising and market research is low emissions. Is it necessarily green? It could be neither green nor brown if it's for just products that have nothing to do with the environment. So I think just generally speaking, and this is not just this paper, this is every paper, I think it's easier to think about brown industry results. So just to conclude, I think that this is a super interesting paper. I think it's important. I think you should all read it. And like I said, I think the authors have taken care of the biggest low-hanging fruit. And aside from just thinking about the motivation, which seems like the authors are doing, I think that this is pretty close to ready to be submitted somewhere. So thank you and great job.
For having me today here. My name is Carmelo. I'm a PhD student in finance at Wharton University and research assistant at CEBRA. Today I'll be presenting this paper. It's still a work in progress, quite please be I would say, so please any comments, any suggestions on your side, especially I want to say that. I was saying before, this is another paper on greenwashing. Please keep in mind that greenwashing and the literature on greenwashing, is it working? Okay. Okay, fantastic. Okay. It's very, the literature on greenwashing is very in its infancy. As you can see, it's very hard to spot. And let me talk about the idea behind this paper. So basically, the idea behind this paper stems from studying two strands of literature in the sustainable finance. So from one side, we know that investors do have preferences toward green asset, but on the other side, we found quite convincing empirical evidence on the fact that investors are quite confused over defining what is green and what is not. And therefore, I try to link these two strands of literature with an intuition that I actually borrowed from research in psychology, which suggests that people, when making complicated choices, rely on mental shortcuts. So the mental shortcuts that I will exploit in this paper is the name of the company. More specifically, I will explore a new channel whereby companies adopt a new name. There is a green name, meaning that evokes sustainability feelings just to persuade the public that their activity, their main activity, are sustainable, are green, arising therefore a concern for greenwashing. So in doing so, I will ask these research questions. The first one is whether a green-related name that I will define shortly, green-related name changes generate positive abnormal returns around announcement day, and whether this effect is the same for all companies regardless of their involvement toward green activities. And then we will look whether do non-green companies that engage in green-related name changes experience negative abnormal returns in the absence of a corresponding adjustment in their operational activities. In doing so, the aim of the paper is to provide one of the first evidence on greenwashing. We will explore the two-time dimensionality of greenwashing. So the first one is in the short term when greenwashing is implemented, when a company adopts a green name. And the second dimensionality is more long-term, when greenwashing is presumably spotted. I will skip the literature for the sake of time, I believe, and let me define what is a green-related name. So in order to define a green-related name, I firstly developed this green dictionary. So it's a list of 22 words, and this list contains words like sustainability, water, emission, that you can see from this figure in this slide. And then I define a green-related name change as any instance where a company adopts a name that incorporates one of these words. And this is what I found. I found that in the last 22 years, almost 300 companies, only in the US, change their name to incorporate one of these words. And then you can see from the slide the background, the breakdown of the number of companies by the name, the green words that they incorporated in their name. And you see that the green word, the word green is the favorite, is the more preferred one. It is followed by water, waste, solar, and so on and so forth. So to give you some examples, what I'm talking about. The green-related name change can happen either by including the green word in the previous name, as it happened in 2002 with Whiteling Lab that became Whitewing Environmental, or can directly change completely the name, as it happened in 2015 to Baoshin that changed its name in Green Standard Technologies. And let me talk about the sample. So I started with a sample of 296 companies. And then I had to go through, I would say, a very painful screening, because I had to drop all those companies that were engaged in M&A or they experienced contaminating news around the event window. And then also drop those companies that with the limited trading data and they were delisted after the name change. So I ended up with a sample of 102 companies that then I divided between green and non-green companies. How did I do that? So basically, in order to define the involvement of these companies toward green activities, I examined their 10K form. As you know, the 10K form is an annual report that the companies trading in the US has to file with the SEC. And in the first part, in the business section of the 10K form, companies describe in detailed manner their activities, the future plans, and so on and so forth. So I examined, I firstly downloaded the 10K form the year before the name change. And I examined the business section of those 10K form, and I was able to divide the companies that were involved in green activities, that were 25, and companies that were not related at all with green activities. They never mentioned in their business description their activities, that their activities were green or somewhat related with the name that they were about to adopt. Later, I also downloaded the 10K the year after, in the same year they adopted a new name, and up to 2 years after, in order to check whether the non-green companies actually went through a real change in the business operation. As you can see, then the non-green companies sample was divided between real change and greenwashing. So real change are those companies that after changing their name, changed also the business activities in order to align with the name that they just adopted. The remaining 62, I couldn't find any reasonable reason for changing their name, for adopting their name. And then I will refer to them as greenwashing. Let me give you an example very briefly. I'm sorry, it's not really clear, just a screenshot, but just to give you an idea. So here we have the 10K in 2014 of Z Holding Group that changed their name in 2015 in Ariel Clean Energy. And this is the 10K in 2015 after the announcement of the green-related name change. You see that when we look at the current business section, nothing happened there. So the company was and remained a company that was seeking for new business opportunities. So we will call cases like this one greenwashing, because they adopted the new name just for persuading the public that they were involved in the clean energy industry in this case. And the way I approach this problem is through a traditional event study approach. In order to announce the results, I also use 3 different models for calculating abnormal returns. I used the 3-factor models, the correct model, and the constant mean model. I used the estimation window, which goes from minus 280 days to minus 30 days prior to the announcement day. And then I check the statistical test using parametric and non-parametric test, especially in the latter through the rank test formulated by Corrado. And let's look what happened when companies change their name, announce the name change. So this represents my main results. So this table basically represents the cumulative average abnormal returns that are divided between the 3 samples. So we have the entire sample, and then the green sample and the non-green sample. And then 0 here represents the announcement date, that the results are divided by 8 different event windows. And you can see that it's very clearly here that the announcement of the name change generated positive and highly significant cumulative normal return only for those companies that were not involved in green activities prior the name change. And the results are quite robust, using different model for assessing normal returns and different both for parametric and non-parametric test. Also, I checked whether this effect was driven mainly by outliers, and I basically built an outlier adjusted sample by getting rid of those firms that fall in the top 10%, the bottom top 10% in terms of cumulative normal return around the 1 day window of the announcement day, and the results still hold. Let me plot you the estimated cumulative normal return using the correct model now. So you can see that companies that were already involved in green activities generate zero cumulative normal return around all the event windows that I'm considering here. However, the announcement data, you can see that produced an effect, a positive effect, only for those non-green companies. You cannot, and then it reverted to zero after 35 days, a pattern that pretty much aligns with the concept of market efficiency. You can see here that prior to the announcement date, there is a kind of a parallel trend between the two series that started diverging, starting from the day -10 to, and then peaked their larger gap 10 days after the announcement date. So I decided to focus on these windows, -10 plus 10, in order to check whether this gap, this difference in terms of reaction is not driven by any cross-sectional characteristic of the firms. And I did it through this regression. Basically, I regressed the cumulative normal return over a dummy variable, which represents the non-green sample. And then I used as control the age of the company, so the logarithm of the years that company has been trading, and then also the average market value, the logarithm of the average market value, price, and volume. As the results show here, the results hold, even controlling for these cross-sectional characteristics. And so the results suggest that non-green companies earned cumulative normal returns that are higher. There are 34% higher than green companies, 33 in case of the outlier adjusted sample. Let's switch the attention to the greenwashing now. So now we'll focus only on those non-green companies, and we'll see whether there is a differential effect for companies that were engaging in greenwashing, companies that actually changed their name to reflect the business they were entering into. The results suggest I used the same methodology before, and again, 8 different event windows. And you can see that from the result, the market were able kind of to grasp the meaning of the signal. And you see that companies that actually changed their behavior after changing their name earned superior abnormal return, even if they're not actually statistically significant for a non-parametric test. What is surprising to me that greenwashing companies, so companies that were announced a green name change without actually change then their behavior, their activities, still earned cumulative normal return that are positive and are statistically significant both for a parametric and non-parametric test, and regardless the model used. Meaning that the investors believed in the signal that the company was delivering to the market. Here I plotted again, as before, the cumulative normal return estimated with the current model and using a larger event windows from -50 to +120 days. Again, prior to the announcement date, the 3 series seems to share the similar pattern, but after the announcement date, they show completely different behaviors. So the companies that gave to the market a real signal through the announcement of the name change experience a very high cumulative normal return that reverted to zero after 100 days, almost. And companies in the green sample generates zero cumulative normal return, while companies in the greenwashing sample experience something very strange. So firstly, to the announcement of the announcement date, during the announcement date, they generate positive cumulative normal return. But after that, you can see this cumulative normal return declining always and constantly through time. And I decided to explore more this dynamic through a simple staggered diff and diff. So basically what I've done, I built firstly a control sample, then for each companies that changed its name, basically identify all other companies that are traded in the US and within the same economic sector and that do not have a green related name. So you see that for each companies with that changed its name, then I found a basket of peers companies, and then for all of them, I downloaded information regarding the market cap, the age of the company, the leverage, and the total revenue. And after that, I performed a nearest neighborhood matching in order to identify the closest peer. This is the way I identify my control sample. And therefore, I use a monthly observation from the year before to the year after the announcement date for each sample group. And I perform this diff and diff. So basically, the dependent variable is the abnormal return, estimated through using the current model, and 18-month rolling windows. And the coefficient of interest here is the gamma 1, which represents the differential effect of adopting the green-related name. And how much time do you have? Okay, perfect. And I can relax then. And then the treatment variable is equal to 1, whether the company belongs to the treatment group, and the post variable represent 1, whether they represent it's 1 when the company announced after the name change. Also, in order to control for timely traded stocks, I use as control the logarithm of the volume of trades and the logarithm of the market value. You see there. And I used also month and firm stock fixed effect. And to check the results, I also set up a more generalized different diff when I split the treatment group into the 3 different categories, so greenwashing, green, and the real change, in order to check whether the results solve those in that case. And the results are quite surprising. So basically, it seems that so you see the first column, the results for greenwashing sample, for the second column for green sample, the third column for the real change, and then the last column for the generalized diff and diff that I defined before. So it seems that it seems basically that there is a significant negative treatment effect only for those companies associated with the greenwashing. And I'm pretty aware about the limitation of this analysis, and maybe Sergey will elaborate a little bit more later about it. But it seems from this analysis, at least it seems that the market were efficient in spotting greenwashing and penalized those companies involved in greenwashing through the name change in a longer time frame. And you can see that maybe they were disappointed, and then they started divesting from those companies that changed their name without changing their behavior. And just to wrap it up very briefly, what we just said. So basically, cumulative normal returns earned around the announcement of a green-related name change are associated with the signal conveyed by the name change. The first part of the paper, I explained the result obtained in the first part of the paper through the lens of the signaling theory. Investors reacted to the name change only if they perceived that there was a signal that the company was about to enter a new business, a new desirable business. And however, in the long run, we found that companies that adopted a green-related name without changing their core business earned a negative monthly abnormal return of the order of 6% after the name change, as compared to the control group that I defined before. And so this is just the key takeaways. And so I basically explored the dynamics of greenwashing through the 2-time dimensionality, short term and the long term. The short term, we found that actually has a positive effect on cumulative normal return. However, in the long run, when presumably greenwashing is spotted, we found that this has a negative effect on abnormal return that is way higher than the benefit that the company is earned during the freeze time dimension. And I believe that it would be interesting having a formal policy in the light of these results that is aimed at curbing the use of deceptive or misleading corporate name to avoid companies surfing the green wave. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me to discuss this paper. So This paper studied the effect of greenwashing on investors' behavior. It's doing it by analyzing green-related name changes. So, for example, if the firm that has name that is not related to anything green changes it to add some words green, sustainable, anything green-related. And the paper finds two important results, in my opinion. One, there is a short-term abnormal return after the green-related name change. The second one is long-term reversal. If the firm does not actually adopt green technology. So if a firm changes name, but then in fact, it doesn't become green, there is a long-term reversal. So in my opinion, this is a very important question because this paper is able to actually show the greenwashing. In most papers that show greenwashing, people focus on reports. And main criticism is that actual investors don't really pay attention to those reports. But name change is unique. So you notice this, you notice that big firm changed the name to green related. So the author doesn't have to argue that this will be noticed by investors. So I think this is the main strength of the paper, that it's really able to show the greenwashing. So I will have three big comments. They are related to each other. So first comment will be whether this story is about greenness or potentially something else. Second comment will be about long-term reversal, which I found the most provoking result of the paper, at the same time the strongest result. So I will spend some time talking about that. And finally, some suggestions for future analysis that can be done in the paper. Can I somehow remove this?
I think you could click on board.
Great, thanks. So any name change would classify as catering. And it's very common, especially at the time after great financial crisis, at the time of dot-com bubbles. And mostly reasons are economic reasons, not green-related reasons. And that's why I think that the correct benchmark should be other name changes. What author does now is, well, he looks at green name changes and compares them to no name change. So in my opinion, the correct should be other name changes. And so if green adds any abnormal returns relative to other name changes, this will be more convincing evidence. To clarify this point a little bit more, so one of the results that the author didn't show in this presentation, but it is in the paper, CEOs don't declare anything green related for these firms that changed names and didn't actually become green. This is a little bit strange. So if CEOs want to greenwash, well, they will have incentives to talk about that. They will say, well, we changed names because we became green. So it was at least a little bit strange. So I think we should find that CEOs are leading this green wave in the paper. Another concerning thing, the coefficients related to greenness are only 10% significant. And I'm talking about short-term results, not long-term reversals. So in short-term results, this might mean that results are not very robust to certain things. So I will give suggestions how to deal with this. But currently, this was something that concerned me a little bit. And finally, mention of greenness. So it's a lot of work done looking at this green names and green words. But for example, would evergreen company be considered green? It has nothing to do with green. Evergreen in this company just means that they will live forever. So it might make sense, I know it's a lot of work, to go over manually of for these firms and eliminate such cases. Or use other metrics of greenness that other papers use to show that results are robust. Another thing that worried me a little bit. So first of all, this pre-trend that starts 10 days before, I would like more economic intuition why we see this pre-trend. It looks like investors, as I mentioned, notice the name change. Why would we see results 10 days before is a little bit strange. But what I found even more concerning is the blue line starts diverging very quickly from the red line. I mean, we can't expect firms to change their policies in 5 days. So it would be nice to explain. It might be a very interesting thing to explain why this blue line diverges so much from the red line very quickly, especially when we talk about long-term reversal. And so suggestions on this comment. So first of all, use the correct benchmark. This is easy, straightforward thing to do. Just look at firm changing names for other reasons as a benchmark. Provide more anecdotal evidence. I found it interesting that the author showed some actual company name changes, and I think If author picks a few companies and shows them going forwards, it will be interesting and convincing. Show that results are robust to other definitions of greenness, as I said. And what I also want to emphasize, my comment about 10% significance, show standard errors for excess return tables. Right now, they only say that it's at least 10% significant. It's interesting how much they are significant, 5, 1, or 10. Okay, my second comment will be about long-term reversal. So author shows that there is a long-term reversal. Specifically, in the presentation, there are different time frames starting from 100 days to 2 years. That there is a green transition for some companies not, and for companies that didn't become green, there is a long-term reversal. So 2 years might be too slow, 100 days even less, to actually transit to green. So for robustness tests just show that firms actually stay non-green for longer periods of time. More interestingly, these long-term reversals can be explained by a paper written by Van Binsbergen, where they argue that impact investment has no impact on cost of capital. It means that if you look at 1 year or longer, there should be no impact of green-related policies on cost of capital, at least if we believe their paper. So if you study long-term impact on cost of capital and show that it's there, that we see where some companies, this green trend stays and doesn't revert, I think this might be a very exciting result and very interesting thing to consider for the paper. Also, results on long-term reversal are very strong and robust in the paper. So I think that, in my opinion, that should be the focus of the paper. And my final comment, what do investors actually do? We do see that there is abnormal return, we see long-term reversal, but what do investors actually do? And the paper currently never shows investment flows. So I think it's important to show that investors actually buy and then sell, rather than just assuming that this is the case. And I also think that addressing this comment might help with identification for my first two comments. So, for example, is behavior of green investors. So we can look at institutional investors, and there are papers that classify institutional investors being green or brown. So we should expect that green investors would actually study the firm and understand if the firm is green or just greenwashing. So we should see interesting differences. Or just look at banks versus bonds. The paper just has been presented showing that banks are different in their financing of brown companies. My paper with Loumioti also studies that shows that banks finance brown companies and bond markets usually leave brown companies when brown companies become browner. So might be interesting distinction between those. So I would like to see more of investors' actions in this regard. So to summarize, I think the paper raises a very important question, and unlike many other papers on greenness, it actually shows greenwashing. Name change, and if author can argue that name change was meant to be related to green, but the company didn't become green, this is good evidence of greenwashing. But I think that there is more work to be done about long-term reversal and investors' actions, and there is more evidence to be shown that this is actually greenness and not something else that drives the results. I wish the author best of luck.
Well, thank you very much for having me here. I'm very excited to present my paper to you, which is a joint work with Coralie Jaunin and Luciano Somoza. I don't know if I should send up or down the stage. And the paper is about green funds again, and the idea is to, again, see whether there is some sort of greenwashing at play. So we started off essentially by wondering whether green funds were taking advantage of their name just to label themselves as green, as good guys, or whether they were sort of honoring their mandate by trying to screen firms further and select the ones that are polluting less or doing better in terms of environmental performances. And later we see whether these funds could have also a way to really screen these firms and end up investing into the ones that pollute less. So in the interest of time, I'm just gonna tell you what we do in the paper, and then I'm gonna show you some results. So essentially in the paper, we apply an unsupervised machine learning algorithm to extract how much of the earning conference calls each firm spent talking about the climate transition. So the idea is to have a measure of the attention to the climate transition at firm time level. And we see whether green funds sort of react to this attention to the climate transition talk. And we have three main findings. The first one is that green funds actually have higher ownership of the firms that talk more about the climate transition, roughly 17% more. And we also find that green funds tend to select stocks according to this measure of attention to the climate transition. And indeed, their ownership after they start talking about it grows twice as much compared to firms that do not talk about the climate transition. Oops. And finally, we also look at whether these funds end up investing in the firms that, I mean, we know that these funds invest in these firms that talk about the climate transition, but we don't know yet whether these firms end up delivering, so to speak, better environmental performances. And we essentially check whether these firms pollute more or less compared to the market. So we find that they pollute less than the market, but anyway, there is an increase in the emission by the firms that talk about the climate transition. So a good result, but probably not the best results. So as I mentioned at the beginning, we use earning conference calls. So these are venues and occasions in which firms talk with their investors about their future plans. And we apply this LDA algorithm, which essentially you can think of it as a sort of a PCA, but applied to text, which essentially takes a document and creates a distribution of topics across these documents, and each topic will be characterized by distribution of words that belong to the topic. So essentially the idea is that we apply this LDA, which is unsupervised, so we don't have to input any dictionary related to the climate transition, and we end up spotting a topic that is related to the climate transition. So among the topics we have, we label the one that is related to the climate transition. And we decided to use the LDA, not the other methods, for multiple reasons. The first one is that the LDA is, topics are easy to interpret because you have the same word belonging to different topics. So you have kind of an idea of why this word belongs to this topic with that probability. And as a consequence, documents are easy to classify. The second point is that this LDA is unsupervised, so we don't have to, input any prior to the algorithm. And this comes in handy because what we are capturing is really related to the climate transition. And finally, we decided to use the LDA also because there are instances in which, for example, the word sustainability is not really related to the climate transition, but also to, for example, revenues and so forth. So this algorithm essentially allows us to be flexible in this respect. And again, we are the ones eventually labeling the topic. So again, we input, we apply the algorithm, we have a set of topics as output, and we label the one that is related to the climate transition. This is just to give you an idea of the outcome of the output of the algorithm. So essentially, all these boxes represent the relative contribution of each word at the top. Do I have a laser? Yes, I do. For example, here we have climate. And in the horizontal axis, we have the topics to which the word climate contributes. So for example, climate contributes to the topic related to the climate transition only by 25%. Whereas we have solar here, and when they mention solar in their earning conference calls, the probability that they are talking about the climate transition is very, very high. And as I was saying before, there are some words, for example, sustainability, that are usually used not for the climate transition, but for other things. So for example, sustainability of entering this market, or sustainability of revenues, and so forth. This is a bunch of graphs to sort of validate the algorithm. For example, here on the top left, we have the topic related to the COVID-19. And as you can see, it was flat up until the explosion of COVID. Then we have, for example, here growth that is sort of a constant over time, but we have these two peaks during the big crisis and so forth. So hopefully we are really capturing what it seems. Then we manually label green funds because we know that the definition is not really clear. So we essentially went through the description of all the funds operating in the US market. And we labeled green only the funds that were explicitly saying that they are investing according to some sort of green measure. So let me now switch to the regression. So the idea here, again, is to see whether green funds try to pay attention to the firms that are in which they're investing in, and whether they're trying to find a way to screen these firms in order to invest more and more efficiently. And the idea is whether they do so beyond the standard environmental score, because they could just say, well, you know what, I'm a green fund, I can just invest in the firms that have high green score, and so I'm good with that. And here the idea is to try to see whether they're doing more than this. So essentially we regress the percentage of the green fund ownership, and we define this for the green funds, for the non-green funds, and for total funds. Then we have our measure of the climate transition talk. So this is again at firm time level. Then we have the environmental score and a bunch of controls, including industry quarter fixed effects. And these are the results. So in the first column, we have the simple regression with the share of green fund ownership onto the climate transition talk variable. Then we add the environmental score. And as you can see, the coefficient is positive and significant in both instances. So this means that if a firm is talking about the climate transition, we see a larger association with a green fund ownership. So essentially they seem to be investing more in the firms that are talking about the climate transition. And our effect survives to the introduction of this environmental score. So this seems that during these earning calls, these firms are conveying additional information. So we're not capturing redundant things here, because indeed we have both of them significant in the specification. Then in the third column, we look at the total share of, all funds. And as you can see, we don't have anything significant, as one would expect. And when we look at non-green funds, so the brown, so to speak, funds, we see a negative coefficient. Then we have a bunch of splits, but essentially they are very, very consistent. So clearly here, these are just correlations, so we are not claiming any causality because we don't have exogenous variations. And here, essentially, we have the chicken and egg problem, right? So we know that the firms that talk more about the climate transition are the ones that have more green funds investing in them, but we don't know whether they're doing so to please their investors, so to speak, or to attract them. So the idea here is to say, well, you know what, let's try to look at the first instances. So the first time they talk about the climate transition, and let's see whether before they were talking for the first time, there was a larger share of green funds investing in these firms, and whether after they start talking, these green funds invest again in these firms. So we isolate a bunch of events in which the firms started talking about the climate transition, and we match these instances with the standard technique in the literature. So essentially, here we compare after the quarter in which the firm starts talking about the climate transition, whether green funds invest or not in such firms. 10 minutes, great. So here on the left, we have a propensity score matching. So here we have the weighting. So the synthetic control will be the weighted average of a bunch of firms. Whereas on the right, we have the standard propensity score matching. So we match the firm with the closest one. As you can see at the top, we have the effect, the change in ownership for green funds. So after they start talking about it, green funds invest more in these firms. So this seems to be a way for the fund to screen these firms and invest in them. And this is the case even 4 quarters after the event, and whether you consider the first or the second matching method. And at the bottom here, we have the same exercise, but for non-green funds. So here the idea is that, well, if I'm a non-green fund and I listen to a firm talking about the climate transition, do I care or do I don't care? And it seems that they don't care at all. So we know that when the firm starts talking about the climate transition, they attract green funds. And I didn't have the time to show you this in this presentation, but we also show in the paper that ex ante, before talking about the climate transition, there is a no overrepresentation of green funds among these firms. So ex ante, they were equal. So now we know that these firms are sort of signaling to the market that they are talking or trying to do something green, so to speak. We know that green funds are investing in these firms, so they're sort of buying their message. And now we are trying to understand whether these firms end up delivering, so to speak, on these promises. And we do this in a bunch of different ways in the paper. We look at portfolios, but as you know, with portfolios, there is discretionality. So the easiest and most agnostic way to do so is to look at the carbon emissions 1 year ahead. So essentially, we see whether they pollute more or less after they start, after they talk about the climate transition. And I would like to bring your attention here. So this is the difference between the CO2, the growth in CO2 emissions for the firms that talk and do not talk about the climate transition. So the market, so all the firms increase their CO2 emissions by 6.7%. And we see that the firms that do not talk about the climate transition increase their emissions by 7.4%, whereas the one that talk about the climate transition increase their emission by 3.4%. So they're doing better than the market, but maybe that's not the figure we were expecting. We were expecting something negative, right? So it's a good news, but not probably the best news. The other thing I wanted to highlight here is that we see in the data that these green funds are investing in the firms that are ex ante the worst in terms of carbon intensity. So they are the worst in class in a way. They are promising to invest and do more about the climate transition, and these green funds are sort of trusting them by investing in them and hoping to do something good for the environment. So, okay, I'm doing very well in time. So to wrap up, we study whether green funds screen firms according to their environmental sort of efforts, so how much time they are talking about the climate transition during the earnings calls. And we find that they do care, so in the sense that try to honor their mandate, so they go beyond the standard environmental score to screen firms according to the environmental efforts. And if you feel philosophical today, this will be associated with the consequentialist streams, because these green funds invest in a way that has an impact, whereas and this is opposed to the Kantian ethics, which is more about value alignment. So this has been proved to be the case for retail investors, which just care about investing in something that seems to be green. Because again, we see in the paper that these green funds end up investing in the firms that ex ante have lower levels of higher levels, of carbon intensity. So they are the worst in class. We also find in the paper that firms talking about the climate transition have better environmental performances, although this may not be enough, because again, we still see that there is an increase on average in their carbon emission. But overall, we came to the conclusion that green funds are sort of truthful about their mandate. They try to honor the mandate, and they do not systemically engage in greenwashing. Although in the paper, we also show that there is a clear communication channel between the firm and the green funds in this case, and this channel may be abused in the future, because now we know that these green funds are the first one that became, so to speak, green. But going forward, if brown firms or firms that are willing to do greenwashing were aware of this channel, they could just show up during the earnings calls, talk about the climate transition, and hope to get some attention from green investors, even though they may not be willing to deliver on those promises. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm looking forward to your comments.
Thanks a lot for having me here, and it's a pleasure for me to discuss what I consider a very well done and accurate paper. So if I had to summarize the paper, I would say that we could identify 4 steps. The first one, that I actually call step 0, is the measuring of climate transition talk. And I think that the authors make a very good case why LDA is a good measure of climate transition talk. So, and I won't spend much time on that, but they made a very good case. Now, the first question that we want to answer here is whether there is a relationship between the fund ownership of green funds and climate transition talk. And indeed, we find a positive coefficient between green fund ownership and climate transition talk. We entered then what Tammaro called the egg and chicken problem. So basically, which one is preceding which one? And in order to answer this question, we have a difference in difference event analysis, where the event that's studied is the first time that a firm ever talks about climate transition. And then the last step of the paper is to check whether this then can actually be used to decarbonize the portfolio of green funds. Now, in my discussion, I have mainly two questions. And then if we will have time, I will also introduce some minor comments. So the first question is that I don't fully understand the incentives of non-green funds. And even though the core of the research question is on green funds, non-green funds still represent the benchmark of what other funds are doing. And I fail to fully understand their incentives. And I'll tell you why. So for green funds, we have clear and robust results. So we have that green fund ownership is positively correlated with climate transition talk. And also thanks to the what I call the second step, so the event study analysis, we are able to say that climate transition talk precedes an increase in green fund ownership. For non-green funds, we do have this significant negative coefficient, which is something that needs to be explained. And also we want to find out what happens in the event study analysis. So here I highlighted the coefficient, and I tried to come with some possible basic explanations of why this is the case. The first one is, do non-green funds perceive climate transition talk as a negative signal? Perhaps we know that they do not, they have already a negative sensitivity to e-scores. So it could be that the climate transition talk of today is a proxy for the e-score of tomorrow, and perhaps they perceive that for some reason as a negative signal. And the second one is, perhaps there exists a substitution effect between green funds and non-green funds. And this is the tentative explanation that is presented in the paper. My opinion in that is that the answer to both questions is no. And why do I think so? So here we have the two charts relative to the event study analysis. So those that Tammaro wanted to present but didn't have time to present. So now I claim 2 more minutes on the presentation because I will need to introduce these two charts. So on the on the left-hand side, we have green fund ownership, and we have the control group is the black one, and the bluish one is the treated group. Basically, the treated group at time 0 is talking for the first time about climate transition. And for non-green fund, we have non-green funds on the right-hand side. What I see here is that even before climate transition talk is ever discussed, there is a significant difference between the treated group and the control group in non-green funds. So no way that this can be a reaction to climate transition talk interpreted as a negative signal. And same reason, we have that there is no substitution effect, because otherwise we would see for the treated group a decreasing trend after the climate transition talk is discussed. Instead, we do have a slightly increasing trend. So I tried to get more in depth on this issue and try to formulate my own hypothesis on that. So basically, we see that there is a statistically significant difference between the treated group and the control group in non-green funds. So one could claim that there exists a hidden variable for which we are not controlling for, so it's not taking part in the matching process, and this hidden variable determines the behavior of non-green funds. And this is what I call hypothesis 1. So if we call this variable X, perhaps we have that non-green funds are sensitive to this X, and they choose to avoid firms with high X. And then those firms, since are not able to attract the funding from non-green funds, engage in more climate transition talk. So this narrative would still fit the results that we have. What could X be? Some sort of, I don't know, business model weakness that is of interest for non-green funds more than for green funds. Now, do I believe this explanation? Not so much. So I came with a second one. So the second one is perhaps that non-green funds are not neutral. So they actively operate against climate transition. They do not believe that green investment is somewhat useful or profitable or whatever. And so, and this is also in line with the result of having a negative coefficient on e-scores. And because of that, perhaps they discourage climate transition talk. And so we have that firms that 4 periods before the first climate transition talk occurs are already, have already a higher percentage of non-green fund ownership. Because of that, they are discouraged of engaging in climate transition talk. And this means that, so according to this hypothesis, for non-green funds, the chicken egg problem comes in the opposite way. So perhaps is the ex-ante fund ownership of non-green funds that is discouraging the climate transition talk. And so this relationship goes in the opposite direction, perhaps when focusing on non-green funds. The second item that I wanted to discuss is profitability. Profitability is one of the firm's control that we have in the regression. And I think it's a very interesting one. And so perhaps the paper could discuss it more. So first of all, and this is still in the picture of understanding overall what are the incentives underlying both green funds and non-green funds. And first of all, I find it interesting that non-green funds have a higher sensitivity to firms' profitability. So they do, a much more intensive scrutiny in terms of profitability. And also something that I find interesting is that profitability is not significant for green funds in the baseline specification where we do not control about of e-scores. And so we could say that all else being equal, green funds are not searching for the most profitable firms because they are committed to their mandate. So this fits the narrative of the paper. And they do care about profitability only once we control for e-scores. So once the e-score is at a certain level, then profitability becomes a significant factor. Now, this comment, intuition, whatever, is not robust because the two regressions as of now have two different samples. So perhaps if you find it interesting, it's for you to test whether this could be an additional comment to put on your results. With regard to the minor comments, so the first one is since we do have a chicken egg problem, as a naive reader, the first thing that I would have expected is perhaps to lag the regressors. And also, and I mean, I think this is costless for you to try and to see. And the second one is I was thinking whether it would make sense to have an autoregressive model and also control for the lagged fund ownership. I don't know how persistent the time series is, and so if it makes sense. Yeah, I mean, the other two are just two additional minor comments. Coming to the conclusion, I think it's a very interesting and policy relevant research question. And so at the end of the presentation, you indeed highlighted what I mean by policy relevant. I think it contains a very convincing identification of climate transition talk. And I like the idea of approaching the analysis of conference calls in an agnostic way and saying, we do not even impose that climate transition is discussed at all. I think that on green funds, you do have robust and solid results. But I think that there is a missing piece of the puzzle that could be the baseline behavior of non-green funds. And also, I found it interesting the results on firms' profitability. And so, thanks a lot.
Okay, so now we'll take questions. I'm going to take advantage of my privilege here to ask the first question. So I have two questions. In regards to the additions of the firms, are they absolute commissions or are they scaled by like per revenue or size? It's dependent on whether the firm's growing. And then also I was wondering, is there any sort of like event that you're viewing that is creating these firms to want to start beginning conversations? Because there's that paper, the economic impact of the ESG ratings, where the downgrade and upgrade, causes funds flows to change. So is it to do with the society, what's happening in